it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Crinan Alexander tonight. You may, or a lot of you may know him already. He's put some beautiful books here that you can look at later. He might tell you more about them. Crinan did his PhD in Edinburgh in experimental taxonomy, and then went and did a fellowship on cotton breeding in Nigeria. He came to RBGE in 1979 and worked on the European Garden Flora. He's worked on that for 20 odd years. He helped set up the MSc in Biodiversity and Taxonomy, and since the mid-90s, he's been working with the Wildwood Group, which is all about Carrifran. So please, welcome to you tonight, and we look forward to your talk. And at the end, we can ask some questions. So think hard and be engaged. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jill. I'm slightly conscious that I have actually stood here twice before and spoken to the Society about Carrifran. So I slightly hope that nobody's got very long memories. I don't think I've done it in the last 15 years, so maybe I'm doomed eternally to recycle lectures on Carrifran in this lecture theatre. A great pleasure, anyway. If you approach Carrifran as it is today, you'll see quite a wooded area with a rather nice car park entrance. We were very careful to disguise it because we realized that nothing attracts parked cars like parked cars. So you basically have to know about Carrifran to visit it. It's quite well hidden. And you immediately get an impression of rather well-established woodland. But it was not always like that. This was taken in 1998 and is a view straight up Carrifran Burn to the rather wonderful crags at the head called Raven Craig. And it's worth mentioning at this point, people often get very flummoxed about whether it's Carrifran, Carrifran or Carrifran. And I believe it's derived from the Welsh Carrifran, which means the seat of ravens. So I suppose a more correct pronunciation is Carrifran, but somehow we've always said Carrifran, which is what the local farmers say. Anyway, I thought I'd just get that one out of the way. I'm now going to take you up to Priest's Gill, just on the left here, and look across Raven Craig. And you can see that it was, although beautiful, extremely desolate, in fact, almost desert-like. And we're looking there up towards, this is Firth Hope, this burn here, where we've done some high planting that I'll talk about later. And as I'm sure many of you know, that barren beauty of Carrifran is by no means an isolated incidence. Most of the southern uplands still look very much like this, occasionally punctuated by blocks of introduced commercial conifers. But we are not the first generation, or maybe I should say generations, to realize this fact. And I was astonished to discover that Samuel Johnson, in his famous journey to the Western Isles, noted that the lowlands of Scotland had once undoubtedly an equal portion of woods with other countries. But I believe few regions have been denuded like this, where many centuries must have passed in waste without the least thought of future supply. Now, of course, he was not taking an ecologist or a biologist view of this. He was merely thinking about the supply of timber, which is rather similar in many ways to the reasons that the Forestry Commission was set up after the First World War. So Samuel Johnson noticed the lack of trees in the Scottish landscape. But luckily, because of research and much data gathering, we know for sure and in some detail that most of Scotland, except for the high tops that you can see in white, the high tops that we can see in white here, and also slightly puzzlingly, the island of Tiree. I think there must be a mistake there. I would have expected Colin Tiree to be much the same. Most of Scotland was covered in trees to some extent or other. And of course, I don't mean by forest, the kind of forest that you go into and it's 20 or 30 feet high and you get lost in. A forest can be trees that come out of the ground and maybe grow more or less horizontally because of the wind conditions. But I am talking about some sort of tree cover, except on the extreme tops of the mountains. By contrast, if you look at this 2008 map produced by the Forestry Commission, you can see the shocking state of native woodland. So the green patches are introduced forestry, And the small brown patches are what the Forestry Commission reckoned was left of native forest in 2008. But we do know from the isolated pockets that we have access to that different types of native woodland do still exist, and certainly did exist in Scotland. And the picture here is of sessile oak forest with an understory of Luzula, not apparently very biodiverse, but we can contrast that with this rather beautiful bit of fragment of native woodland on Raking Gill near Dobbs Lynn, just east of the Grey Mare's Tail. Dobbs Lynn is interesting for quite a different reason. It's the type locality of a famous graptolite. Maybe somebody here knows more about that than I do, but it's something I always remember when I drive past it. By contrast, this is a view taken many years ago of a small islet on a loch in Mull. Now, you may think those two views are strikingly dissimilar, but there's one enormously similar thing about them, that the trees in both of those photographs, and there are very few trees in this photograph, only exist because they have escaped the attention of browsing herbivores. In this case, of course, the herbivores are unwilling or unable to swim across the loch and eat such trees as there are there. In Raking Gill, the slopes are steep enough to prevent the attentions of goats and deer. We don't have to travel very far to realize how very different this state of affairs might be. This is a sort of medium altitude shot taken in Norway in autumn, and it's got a flourishing population of juniper, birches, and willows. This was taken several years ago by Des Thompson, a name that will probably be familiar to some of you. And if we go slightly further up the mountains in Norway, we see a beautifully developed montane scrub population. So why is this not happening in Scotland? And I think as the evening progresses, or should I say my talk progresses, certainly not for the whole evening, we will see that it is almost certainly due to grazing and browsing pressure from herbivores. So we go back to Carrifran in the late 90s. You can see we had thriving populations of feral goats, lots of sheep. Down in Carrifran Valley itself, we had cows. And I just put as a little inset there the kind of effect that goats will have on anything that dares to stick its shoots above ground level. And it's widely quoted that we probably have something like 10 times too many deer in Scotland. At this point, I want to introduce you to a rather remarkable man that some of you may know. This is Philip Ashmole, who was on the staff of Edinburgh University for about 30 years in the zoology department. He had an extremely successful career as an ornithologist. He also worked on invertebrates. He and his wife published a book on invertebrates in St. Helena and also in Ascension Islands, I think. When he retired about 30 years ago, he became heavily involved in local environmental matters in Peeblesshire. His wife had already set up an organization called Peebles Environment Concern. And it's no exaggeration to say that without Philip and Myrtle Ashmole, Carrifran would not exist. Among other activities, Philip and his wife and others organized a conference on restoring Borders woodland in 1993. And at this conference, Chris Badenoch, who used to work for SNH, as it was then called, revealed the fact that he reckoned that only 0.06 of Tweeddale actually was covered in native forest. I mean, that is so small a proportion that it's almost unthinkable, 0.06. Anyway, rather than simply joining in the general wailing and gnashing of teeth, which was certainly going on at that time about the lack of native forest, Philip decided that maybe it would be a good idea to try and do something about it. And he collected together a very disparate group of ecologists, botanists, archaeologists. There was even a lawyer, there was a landscape architect. And we started meeting regularly in the late 1990s. And we thought that one of the things we had to do first was to produce a mission statement. I'm not sure if I'll read it right out. You could probably read it to yourselves. But basically, we were going to try and establish something equivalent to native forest, or what we think native forest might have been like. And this, we hope, would not be managed. We hoped it would be self-sustaining. And we were keen that access would be open to everybody. So having produced that mission statement, we certainly had plenty to think about. Now, I do want to mention at this point this organization called Borders Forest Trust. Borders Forest Trust, which is a charitable body, more or less got going at the same time as we were meeting and deciding that we wanted to try and create a Wildwood. But we realized very soon that we, as a bunch of well-meaning, mostly it has to be said, incomers, didn't have the resources to run this sort of organization. And once we actually started to amass some funds, to our astonishment, you know, we needed a backup, we needed admin, and that's what Borders Trust very firmly provided for us. Borders Forest Trust was funded through the National Lottery, and I think the staff numbers about half a dozen, and they are extremely dedicated and very hardworking people, and they have a number of other projects throughout the borders. So we spent considerable time looking for a site. We had quite a number of false starts. Some places were suitable, but then the owner discovered he couldn't sell it to us for inheritance tax reasons. You know, we had about 4 or 5 very promising sites become available, only to find that they just escaped our clutches at the last minute. But then one day, purely through a chance remark, a friend of a friend remarked, "Oh, my cousin's just recently bought a farm in the southern uplands. Maybe he would sell you some of it." So we approached this man and he said, "Yes, certainly I'll sell you some of it, but I would like you to pay me £1 million. So that kind of set us back on our hunkers a bit. We withdrew, we went back again, we negotiated, we renegotiated, we withdrew, and eventually we managed to get him to agree to sell us Carrifran Valley for £300,000. That is still quite a lot of money, but it is indeed a serious reduction. One of the consequences of this agreement was that he was not going to make the whole valley available to us at once, because he wanted to go on getting subsidies, which of course, as those of you who know anything about farming in Scotland and in Britain, it's generally all about subsidies. So he wanted to go on getting his subsidies for several years. So he withdrew from Carrifran in parcels. Now, this was in some ways very useful because there's no way we could have grown all the trees to populate Carrifran all at once. But it did mean that we had to embark on a very painful and painstaking process of fencing. So the whole of the valley was divided up into blocks, not regular shapes, I assure you, and we gradually populated it with trees. That's a slightly closer view. You can see this is the main road running up to Glasgow. So there's Beattock Summit, Moffat, and this is the road to Selkirk. And actually just up the road from Carrifran is the Grey Mare's Tail, owned by the National Trust. And of some interest also is that this valley next to Carrifran, which is called Black Hope, is very, very similar to Carrifran, but so far hasn't had any trees planted in it. So we have rather a nice control at the moment. So we can look at Carrifran and we can look at Black Hope and get a very strong assessment of what we've achieved. Yes, I should say about Carrifran Valley that we were so glad we didn't go for any of the previous possibilities, because it is just about perfect for what we wanted to do. It faces south. Where are we going? It faces pretty much south. It has an enormous range of altitude from 150 meters down in the car park up to 820 meters at the top of White Coombe. Because it's a complete watershed, we were not sharing land use with anybody else, which was enormously important to us. We wanted to be able to be, you know, the rulers of our own little kingdom as far as ecological restoration went. So there is a view of the valley as it was around the time that we took possession of it. So we had our sights on this valley. We still, of course, had to raise £300,000. We still had to find an awful lot of small trees, and we had to decide where we were going to plant the trees within the valley. So we had a few things to think about. And we organized what turned out to be a very important conference actually held in this very lecture theatre in 1998. And the theme was Native Woodland Restoration in Southern Scotland, Principles and Practice. And we managed to attract a very impressive array of academics, senior administrators, agency staff, among whom was George Peterkin, who used to be a senior member of the Forestry Commission. And one of the things he advised us very firmly to do was not to plant above 400 meters. Now, I'm not sure if this would have occurred to us, but he reckoned with his experience that any effort we put into planting above 400 meters would probably be wasted. Many of the trees would fail. And he also said that if you can establish your population, your new environment below 400 meters, sure as hell, the trees themselves will spread up above 400 meters in the areas that are suitable. So that was the most important piece of advice. All sorts of other things came out of that meeting, but that is the one thing that I particularly remember because we seriously took that on board. We also had a bit of luck, as well as working very hard. And it may seem quite unrelated at first, but a hill walker was walking along this area of raised bog, sorry, blanket bog, just above Carrifran, which rejoices in the name of Rotten Bottom. He was a clinical psychiatrist, and he saw a curious piece of wood sticking out of a peat hag. So he thought, well, it's rather odd, haven't seen anything like that here. So he pulled this bit of wood out, and I believe there was something dangling from it at the other end. And he stuck this piece of wood down behind his backpack, and he went home, and then he took it out and showed it to his family. By that time, whatever the dangly thing was had fallen off, which is slightly unfortunate. It turned out to be the oldest yew wood bow ever found in Britain. And it was dated at 6,000 years before present. Now, of course, the tantalizing thing is that that thing that was dangling off it was probably the remains of the bowstring. So it would have been wonderful for archaeologists and others to know what the bowstring was made of. However, we weren't going to go on agonizing about that. But as it turned out, because of the publicity about the bow, which is now in the National Museum of Scotland, the palynologists at Stirling became interested. They must have read about it or heard about it. And a team of them, led by Richard Tipping, I'm not sure if he's still working in Stirling, came and started taking peat cores through vertical peat cores down into the peat in Rotten Bottom. And one of the things they succeeded in doing was in getting a core right down to the underlying rock. Now, the significance of that is that at the very bottom of that core, they were sampling the very first peat laid down after the ice retreated about 10,000 years ago. So they had this extraordinary record through identifying the pollen grains of exactly what was growing in Carrifran area at any time between 10,000 years ago and just a few years ago. So we decided that because we were obviously going to have to indulge in some sort of publicity, fundraising and all that, that we would focus our efforts around the date of the bow. And for a long time, Carrifran was known as the Valley of the Bow, but we thought that probably we weren't going to run with that one. So our plan was to try and recreate is perhaps too strong a term, to try and mimic as well as we could the forest that was growing in the valley at the time that the bow was lost or thrown into the bog. And we asked Robert Hardy, who some of you may remember was the star of a long-running series called All Creatures Great and Small, to come and launch our fundraising campaign, because it turned out he was a member of the Royal Company of Archers, so he knew all about old bows. So in 1998, Robert Hardy turned up with Dan Jones, the finder of the bow, and a small television crew and various members of the Wildwood Group. And he drew a replica bow. He fired it not very far, I have to say. But at that moment, our fundraising campaign was launched, and we were all hell-bent on trying to raise £300,000 within 2 years, because that was the agreement we had with the man who'd originally asked us for £1 million. I partly put that in because I'm going to give you a sneak preview of that very same view several years later. And this is Myrtle Ashmole. I introduced you to Philip a few minutes ago. This is Myrtle talking to a lovely man called Professor Aubrey Manning, who was Professor of Natural History here in Edinburgh for many years. I think he's no longer with us. So we were faced with this rather massive problem of trying to raise £300,000. And we had what you might call a many-pronged approach. A well-known wildlife artist called Chris Rose painted this astonishing picture for us called Carrifran Lookout. I still look at that and I think it must be a photograph, but it's not. It's a painting. He gave us the painting. We sold it for £5,000. We had hundreds of copies printed. We sold the copies. Peebles Folk Club helped us by doing gigs out in the street in Peebles and other places. We garnered endorsements from celebrities. Chris Bonington came and said that he generally thought the whole thing was an extremely good idea. We slowly began to amass keen supporters. We realized it was very important to keep in touch with our supporters. It's no good having supporters if you don't continually make them feel part of what's going on. We gave lectures, we wrote magazine articles, we sent out thousands of fundraising brochures in other organizations' journals. The John Muir Trust kindly agreed that we would be allowed to put flyers in their journal. And I think we probably did the same with the Society. I'm not quite so sure, but maybe somebody will remember. And to our distinct amazement, the money started to come in. This was the late 90s. Interest rates were running at about 10%. People felt very comfortable and they felt very happy to contribute to an organization like this. And I remember after a talk I gave, not in here, somebody came up and got his checkbook out and said, he didn't exactly say, how much do you want? But the money just seemed to flow. It was quite extraordinary. We had over 500 people subscribe and they became founders of the Carrifran Wildwood. One or two gave us as much as £25,000. And by late 1999, we had £400,000 in the bank. So then we realized that Carrifran was definitely going to become ours. So our next task was to decide what we were going to plant where, bearing in mind George Peterkin's advice that we basically were not going to plant above about 400 meters. There are one or two exceptions that I'll mention in a little time. We had a series of these wonderful maps drawn by Myrtle Ashmole, and they show you the planting types. It's too small to see. I mean, some of you may want to come up and look at the map afterwards, but the basically the orange areas are unplanted. Those are the areas that we hope that any successful woodland will then seed its way up into. Just trying to see if I can make out what some of these other types are. Yes, the 2C there, that is upland oak birch woodland. Basically, we designed a mosaic of slightly different woodland types, depending on soil moisture, soil type, exposure, and also the existing vegetation, which was classified according to the NVC, the National Vegetation Classification. And that gave us an idea of what sort of woodland might be there were it still in existence. One of the problems with Carrifran, or the area, is that it is part of an SSSI, the Moffat Hills SSSI. So that meant that any operations that we performed had to be approved by SNH. That was good in some ways and bad in other ways. And another constraint we had was that our plantings were basically all paid for by the Woodland Grant Scheme through the then Forestry Commission. And although they gave us an enormous amount of money over the years, they also kept an extremely close eye on how the woodland developed. And they came and inspected every few years. And if after a good inspection, we got a further tranche of our grants. And on one or two occasions, they threatened to take back some of their grants because they said the woodland hadn't developed properly. But of course, we discovered that they had a slightly different idea of what a woodland is compared to what we thought a woodland was. One small example is that they didn't consider horizontal juniper to be a tree because it doesn't stand up properly. Now, you would think that the Forestry Commission might not be quite so narrow in their definition. We do actually feel that we educated them to a certain extent. Of course, organizations like this nearly always run on committee meetings. So the steering group met and still continues to meet in the Ashmole's house. We used to meet very, very regularly at the time when everything was extremely busy, when we were raising funds, when we were gathering seed, when we were raising saplings. We now meet about twice a year just to keep a sort of running eye on things. And of course, we also have an ecological planning group, and that's a picture of the ecological planners down below here. That's Stuart Adair, who is one of our main ecologists. Hugh Chalmers was our first project officer. And so, having raised the money, on on Millennium Day, the 1st of January 2000, Carrifran became ours. So what did we do? We went and planted some trees. And we started by planting somewhat randomly in an area called Barker's Paddock, which is right down at the bottom, fairly near the road. But we felt we had to do something on that particular day. And by great good fortune, we had an introduction to a rather wonderful woman called Kate Charlesworth, who used to do these rather splendid cartoons in The New Scientist. Usually they would explain, as she put it at the top, life, the universe, and almost everything else. And she lived at Wynn Square, where is it, north of Peebles somewhere. And she did this rather splendid page for us, which appeared in the back of The New Scientist at around the time, just when we were starting to plant. And it's got ravens explaining things to each other, dogs explaining things to each other, some quite recognizable people planting trees. There's a bagpiper somewhere. Can't make him out. Yes, there he is. That's Myrtle Ashmole's brother playing the pipes. Anyway, it repays a bit of closer study if you're interested. And this was all good publicity, of course. So I mentioned earlier on that fencing was really quite a problem that we had to tackle. And you can see that because of not only having to fence the perimeter, which is about 15 kilometers long, we also had to put these internal fences in that then gradually we were able to take out. But it's no mean feat to fence in these sort of situations. That's the boundary fence on the south. Where are we? That's on the southwestern side of Carrifran. And of course, it has to be said that conditions up there are not always like they were in the first photograph. And this is one of our many, many volunteers checking the boundary fence during the winter to make sure that it hasn't been broached. Those of you who are familiar with fencing at all will know that in cold weather, the wire, of course, tends to contract. And very often the fence posts then get pulled out of the ground because of the contraction of the wire. So it's very important that we check the fence extremely regularly. Almost all the seed collecting was done by volunteers. And here they're collecting sessile oak in Glentrool in Galloway. Our avowed aim was to try and collect all our germplasm, all our seed or cuttings or whatever, within 25 kilometers of Carrifran, because we wanted to be absolutely sure that the provenance was correct. But in the event, we had to go slightly further afield. Oaks, we had to go eventually to the Lake District to get high altitude Quercus petrea, and we had to go as far as Ben Lawes to get some of the montane willows. But on the whole, for most of our trees, the seed was collected within 25 kilometers of Carrifran. And here is a splendid man, alas, no longer with us, Michael Matthews, who organized. He was a retired mathematician, and it certainly showed up in the way he organized everything. He organized the seed collecting program with military precision. And he grew a lot of seeds in his own garden. But of course, we soon realized that if we were going to raise thousands, hundreds of thousands of saplings, it was going to have to be done commercially. And in the bottom right corner there, you can see some of us examining the development of crataegus, of hawthorn plants in a nursery further east in the borders. And it's very important to mention at this moment an important donor, David Stevenson, who was the former owner of the Edinburgh woolen mills. He decided that he was going to pay for the raising of all the saplings. And so far, he's given us £125,000. So that was a most extraordinarily generous act. And of course, I'm not sure if he realized quite how open-ended it was when he said, yes, I'll pay for all your saplings, because we are still collecting seed and saplings are still being grown. That's a picture of volunteers planting. That's just Raven Craig just there. That's George Moffat, who was our second project officer. Just occasionally, volunteer tree planters are allowed to cool off a bit. Volunteers have contributed massively to this program. High camps, which I'll say a bit about later, weeding, bracken bashing, fence monitoring, vole guard and tree guard removal, and of course, endless committee work. Sometimes volunteers are allowed to relax, and I have to say they weren't always, when I happened on them, they weren't always quite as formally dressed as they are in this picture. So that's our first project officer, Hugh Chalmers, heading up Carrifran Valley with a load of saplings to plant. He was a very happy man. But again, as with the raising of the saplings, as with the propagation, we realized that there was no way we were going to be able to plant all this with volunteer labor. So we employed a number of different firms who actually put the trees in the ground for us. They mostly planted below this magical figure of 400 meters. We've done quite a lot of experimental planting higher up that I'll say something about. And you can see the sort of quantities of saplings that arrived from the tree nursery before they were then taken up the valley and planted according to the mosaic pattern that I showed you in the map. Right, Greg, I'm now just going to break off. Oh, it seems to be happening. I need say nothing about this. I could have just shown you that, really. That's pretty much the whole talk. But how do I get back? Just press on. Right. Yeah, that's fine. I think that's the most amazing montage of different slides prepared by various different members of the Wildwood Group. Quite a lot were taken by Philip Ashmore. And if you want to look at it again, it's available on the Borders Forest Trust website. I'll just show you a few more detailed shots, slightly more intimate shots of different areas of the valley. It was clear to us at the beginning that open space is extremely important because we wanted to try and achieve an uneven age structure as quickly as possible. If we'd filled the whole thing with saplings of the same age, we would have ended up with a forest of more or less identically aged trees. So our hope, in fact, it is happening, is that the trees, once they start to reproduce themselves, will seed into the open areas. We were also, actually, I'll just leave that on. We were also instructed not to plant in quite a number of areas where there were important mosses and liverworts growing, in areas where the ground is slightly more base rich. I'm not quite sure whether that's going to last, because I suspect that once our trees start to seed themselves, they may seed themselves into these areas. And we may have objections from some of the biologists. I don't know what David thinks about that. We will discover. So that's a view looking up towards Raven Craig again. Slightly different from the picture I showed you earlier on. Oh, yes, I should say this picture was actually published in The Independent sometime last summer. There's an organisation called Scotland, the Bigger Picture or Brighter Picture. And we had a visit from members of that group, and they then wrote an article that was published in The Independent. Trees, which have now become wonderfully dense in places. One of the things that gives me greatest pleasure is to see junipers achieving this wonderful shape. Some of them look almost like giant shuttlecocks. Most beautiful tree. And harking back to the early pictures and the map, there was a track running up the valley, more or less straight up towards Raven Craig. And that has now almost become totally obscured. You have to fight your way. You almost have to fight your way to get up the valley now, which is extremely gratifying. I may be exaggerating slightly. So having said a bit about the main plantings below 400 meters, I just want to say a little bit about some more, what you might almost call experimental planting that we've done up in Firth Hope. One of the advantages of planting up there was that we managed to do it from our own funds rather than using forestry grant. So it meant that we could more or less do what we liked. You know, we weren't, if the trees failed, we weren't going to get into enormous trouble. We still had to abide by SNH's rules as far as the SSI was concerned. So we've held a series of high camps, sometimes at quite inhospitable times of year. The volunteers camp, wake up extremely cold in the morning and then plant trees all day. Then they get back in their tent again at night. Then they get up the next morning and plant more trees. And then they go home. So if that appeals to any of you, I can give you a contact to get in touch with. And here, one of the results is downy willow, planted in 2002, which is now more or less established a proper habitat of montane scrub. And I think we've demonstrated to our own satisfaction anyway, that you can grow almost anything at almost any height. It's not to do with exposure. It's all to do with herbivores. If you can keep the herbivores off, trees will grow. We occasionally had to resort to slightly mechanized ways of getting the equipment up to the high camps. But after a time, we began to feel that somehow using a helicopter was somehow inappropriate to our aims. And we found a way of getting up to the back of the top of Carrifran by using a tracked vehicle going up through the grey mare's tail. Yes, well, this was one of the few trees actually growing in Carrifran at the time we took it over. It's a rather splendid rowan, so it became a rather iconic part of our fundraising programme. And then, to our astonishment, it was nominated for Scottish Tree of the Year, and it became Scottish Tree of the Year. It was then nominated for UK Tree of the Year, and it became UK Tree of the Year. But it didn't do quite so well in Europe afterwards. And don't know whether it was the fact that Brexit was going on at the time, but it didn't do very well as far as becoming European Tree of the Year. But it's a rather splendid tree. And we know that actually rowan will grow almost anywhere as long as the grazing pressure is reduced. And one of the most gratifying things has been to see how things have developed just because of taking the herbivores off, not just the growing of the trees themselves. It's very easy to imagine a goat, oops, sorry, I pressed the wrong button. Easy to imagine a goat standing on its hind legs in the burn, nibbling away at this ivy. Keep the goats out. Look what happens to the ivy within a few years. And one of the most interesting things, apart from the development of the trees, has been how the herbs have developed in Carrifran. They've become astonishingly rich, particularly along the gravel surrounding on either side of the burn. Here we've got bladder campion and mountain sorrel, Silene vulgaris, Anoxyria digyna. We just saw none of this when we took Carrifran over, so some of this came as a very pleasant surprise to us. Biolutea mountain pansy, marsh marigold, Caltha palustris, almost looking as if they've been planted in a garden. Ladies' bedstraw, Gallium verum, and astonishing display of Scottish bluebell, harebell. Just, I've almost never seen it in such profusion. Water ravens living up to its name. And some relative rarities. This is Vicia oribus, variously known as upright vetch or wood bitter vetch, restricted to rocky woods. Here on Raven Craig, it was probably there before we started our activities. I think it was on ledges where it could escape the attention of goats. Alpine sawwort, mostly on mountain ledges in western Scotland, but very happy at Carrifran. Parsley fern ramping across the scree. This is bog bilberry, Vaccinium uliginosum, and crowberry, Empetrum nigrum. Globe flower, looking extremely happy. When we first took over Carrifran, it was restricted to a few ledges up by the waterfall. But as soon as we took the grazing pressure off, it became established much lower down, having been washed down the burn. And a fairly rare forget-me-not, Myosotis stolonifera, growing in small streams. I feel time is pressing. I really want to say something about things other than plants. You will not be surprised to hear that the bird population has changed fantastically. We have to try and bear in mind that our aim was habitat restoration. We weren't just trying to grow trees. If you visit Carrifran in May and June, you are now almost deafened by the sound of willow warblers. There's a sound you just did not hear at all before about 2005. We also have grasshopper warblers. This is just a very small selection. Blackcap. Of course, this is certainly not due to tree planting. This is a lek of blackcock that we have fairly high up on Carrifran. And of course, I'm sad to say that their numbers are probably decreasing, maybe as a result of tree planting activities. Dotterels have appeared. They probably pass through anyway, but very, very nice to see them. This is a peregrine's dining table with the telltale feathers left lying around. The bird work was almost entirely done by one of our volunteers, John Savory. And you can see him here with his group of Tuesday volunteers. He did some serious scientific work on the change of bird populations in Carrifran and has published them. I've left a list of publications out at the front. But this is the graph he achieved after several years' work. And you can see that this line, this is basically the decline in the meadow pipit. And this is an increase in, I think, 19 different woodland birds, extremely marked. That's just a slightly different way of representing it. I don't know why the willow warblers crashed in 2015 or 2016. I don't have any more recent figures, unfortunately. I also need to say something about other animals. Some of these pictures look particularly amateurish. The reason is that they were all taken in Carrifran on the spur of the moment. So obviously I could have found a much better picture of a red squirrel than that, but I thought that would be cheating. So we have red squirrels, we have foxes, badgers, pine marten, and I'm sorry to say we also have grey squirrels recently. Now the grey squirrels have been reported to the local red squirrel enthusiasts, so they are going to do their best to trap them or remove them anyway. Of course, there's been a change in insect population. This is a puss moth hanging upside down. We have poplar hawk moth. I would like to be able to say more about the fungi, but I have very, very few slides of toadstools. And I feel particularly embarrassed about this because among our audience today is Roy Watling, who had a most fundamental effect on recording the fungi of Carrifran, both before and after the trees were planted. And here's a picture of Roy leading the South of Scotland Fungus Group on a foray in Carrifran on his 80th birthday, which is perhaps a year or two ago, if I'm not so indelicate as to be able to say that, Roy. I believe the fungus total was about 123 species, but I think it's probably way above that now. If you do have any fungus questions, you can address them to Roy at the end of the lecture. I'm sure he'd be happy to answer them. We have diseases, of course, too, in the forms of fungi. This is the rather ghastly Phytophthora that attacks juniper dieback. We have ash dieback. We've even had to fell some of our ash trees because there was a risk of them falling on visitors. Of course, dead wood is not a bad thing in a developing forest because of the effect it has on the insect populations and the fungi populations. Fungus on aspen. And we also have other sorts of pests. These are the tunnels of long-tailed field voles. And we've had to protect every single one of our 750,000 trees with small vole guards. It's been the most enormous undertaking. And it's also a source of some annoyance because we now have these very brittle tubes left behind on the hillside. Some cartoonist heard about the fact that we had a vole guard on every tree and decided to put their own interpretation on the story. We have deer, which we control by shooting. The problem will probably get worse as the trees get denser. And this is our first project officer who dug himself a bolt hole so that he could emerge very early in the morning and shoot the deer before they were expecting anybody to be about. Of course, shooting deer does have some benefits. I apologize to the vegetarians here, but it seems to me that if your meat has had a happy life, it's dispatched extremely rapidly, it tastes good, and it happens to be your enemy, then there's quite a lot of reasons for eating it. Other problems we had include avalanches, and we had a serious fire early on, but we managed to make good the damage done by that. We've had a lot of visitors from different groups. This is a group from the John Muir Trust visiting with their then CEO, Nigel Hawkins. We have many university groups. This is a group visit by SNH, Scott Nat, as they're now called, a few years ago. And we feel, for the reasons that I discussed earlier, that in some ways we have indirectly affected government policy about how reforesting and re-establishment of native forests should be carried out. We have many student groups. This is a group from Bangor on a slightly less than ideal day. This is I'm aware of the fact that the time is pressing me a bit. I just did want to say something very quickly about one or two of our other projects. So I'll just show you. This is Carrifran here. And this is an area designated as potential wild land by SNH. And since Carrifran was bought, Borders Forest Trust have managed to buy a piece of land over here encompassing the Devil's Beef Tub, and also a much larger slice of land stretching north to Talla Reservoir. I won't say much about Corehead and the Devil's Beef Tub. It's not a particular project I've been involved in, but I would like to say just a little bit about Talla and Gameshope. This is an area nearly 3 times the size of Carrifran, and we only acquired it in 2016. So not a lot of planting has happened yet. It is again wonderfully barren. This is Talla Reservoir, Gameshope Burn going up towards Carrifran. Talla water here. That photograph was taken from a light aircraft piloted by yet another of our volunteers. It's a pretty wild area, Talla and Gameshope. I don't know if any of you have walked through it. That's looking north towards Gameshope Loch. And it's probably the closest approach to an Arctic alpine environment that we have in the southern uplands of Scotland. That's the upper reaches of Talla and Gameshope with David Long striding forward. And as with Carrifran, there were little pockets left behind of the previous vegetation. This is an aspen grove beside Gameshope. A quite diverse bit of small woodland. Occasionally we noticed things like dog's mercury growing in the boulder scree, which of course immediately tells us something. Dog's mercury is an indicator of ancient woodland. So what is it doing there growing out of the boulder scree? We had some less welcome remnants. We found the remnants of a Picea abies, Norway spruce forest, growing along the burn. But Hugh Chalmers and his gang managed to ringbark them all a few years ago. And I'm pleased to say that most of them have died, providing us with some nice rotten wood. Slightly less easy to deal with is a serious invasion by Sitka spruce at the very northern end of Talla and Gameshope. We're really not quite sure how we're going to tackle this, and it's possible we may have to accept the fact that some of our mixed forest may have to encompass some foreign incomers, not something we're very happy with at the moment. That's the first day of planting at Talla and Gameshope. The last thing I want to do is just to say a little bit about a very interesting area here called Talla Craigs, where there's been a very pronounced development of herbs like there was in Carrifran. These are some dwarf birch plants that we actually put in. They got slightly drawn up in the nursery. That's not really how people mostly imagine dwarf birch to look, but they're flourishing at the moment. That's just a meeting of the ecological planning group. Downy willow planted has been doing really well on Talla Craigs. And this plant is an enormous tea-leaved willow that was obviously there originally, or possibly a hybrid of it. dwarf willow in abundance on Talla Craigs, roseroot, and a wonderful tall herb community at 700 meters. So above all at Talla and Gameshope, there's plenty of room for trees. That's looking across from Talla Craigs towards Nicky's Now, looking more or less northeast. There are all sorts of people, of course, that I could acknowledge, and most of the formal ones come in the first few paragraphs. I won't read them out. They've often been thanked. They're mostly our donors as far as funding goes. But standing here, I do have to acknowledge the help of the society, because the society, mostly under the leadership of Douglas McKean, who I think is here somewhere, made a number of field meetings at Carrifran in the early days, both before we planted the trees and afterwards. And it's one of the reasons that our baseline recording is so good. So I'm very happy to acknowledge the help of the society and also the help of the Botanics and many of its staff members over the last 25 years. And you can see all their names written there. And I feel I should also slightly sneakily mention my various line managers who knew that I was spending time on Carrifran, which was not actually in my job description. There's a list on the table here of publications relevant to Carrifran, which you might like to look at. And we have published 2 different books. The Carrifran Wildwood story was written about 10 years after we started planting, so in 2009. And then a more general book about Carrifran itself, but also about other Borders Forest Trust enterprises, was just published a couple of years ago. I'm sad to say I can't sell you any of them because I only have a very few myself, but I've indicated how you can get hold of them. The Carrifran story is obtainable online, and if you care to try, I urge you not to use Amazon. There are plenty of ways of buying things that don't involve using Amazon, and the more recent book is available from the publishers. So I think it is high time I stopped. Thank you very much.
For the time lapse.
Yes, yes,
Perfect.
great sequence.
Are there any questions? I saw. Oh, sorry, I'm trying to shout.
You want to use?
Yeah, I can come over here.
I never even checked if everybody could hear me.
Well, you would have had people telling you if they had.
Oh, good.
Yes, I'm sure. Sorry, so Mike just waved his arm. So question here, please.
It's really about growing the trees. Obviously, I think you grew them at Alba trees.
Some of them, yeah, not entirely.
No, it's like, I mean, basically, you've got wild seed. You then took it down to Alba trees or somewhere else. Did that affect the medium that you're growing them in, or did you have to choose a medium which was applicable to the forest site? How did you do it?
I think the media were almost entirely chosen by the propagators. I mean, the important thing to us is to get them germinated.
Right.
Once they were reasonably strong, we hoped that they would then cope with being transplanted into a much less favourable environment. And on the whole, it worked. Yeah. We did have, I won't go, we had problems with propagation. Sometimes we found they'd muddle the seed up. I'm not talking about Alba trees here, I hasten to add. But we did have enough, we had to keep a close watch on them to make sure that we were really getting the saplings from the seed that we delivered to them. Very important.
Sorry, I should say I should repeat the question.
Oh, right.
Because it has been recorded, isn't it?
Oh, right.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that was a question about the medium that the saplings were planted in. Sorry about that. John.
You explained right at the start, you explained how you had created this, I think, 15-kilometre perimeter fence to keep out the grazing animals, and you had all the time been emphasising the fact that you can only grow trees to keep out the grazing animals. But then later on, you showed us some deer, and so presumably by now, has the fence been breached?
No, the fence is still in pretty good condition, but one of our problems was, although we managed to raise a startling amount of money, we could not pay for a deer fence. So the perimeter fence is just a stock fence, and it should keep out sheep and goats. Of course, as you know, what happens in Scottish hills in the winter, the snow is this deep, and they just step over the fence. You know.
you're aiming for a wild wood, which you clearly are,
Yes,
then it ought to be a wood where you don't have to manage it. It
Well,
ought to be a sustainable
this is-
woodland,
yeah, this is,
like it was before humans came.
yes. We feel constrained by the fact that there are 10 times too many deer in Scotland. And we realize there are three things we're going to have to go on doing. One is shooting deer. One is keeping the perimeter fence in good condition to keep out the goats. And the other is weeding of sycamore, Sitka spruce. That's certainly what's going to happen at Carrifran. The philosophy of this may be different in Talla and Gameshope, where it's being done on a bigger scale. But I suppose to our regret, we realise that at Carrifran, those three activities will probably have to go on taking place. So you could say it doesn't fit your definition of a wildwood, and I wouldn't argue with you. Oh, yes, 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 we have. Yes.
So the question was, have they acquired all of the land that they originally agreed with the landowner?
Yes. Yes, I mean, he probably finally withdrew in about 2008, so a long time ago. Yes. One thing, I mean, there's no time to go back now. One thing I meant to say when I had the map up showing all the different areas that Borders Forest Trust is now involved in, is that we would dearly love to join them together. But it's not always possible, you know, because habitat restoration, even in quite large chunks, is all very well, but you do need these corridors, you need these big areas. So that's something still at the back of our mind, how to make the area even bigger.
What places it learned from first thing to make the initial establishment more efficient or
So the question is, what lessons has been learned for the new planting for the second site?
It sounds a bit smug, but I think we got it about right. It worked. You know, Carrifran is there and it's full of trees. What would we have done different? I suppose we might have raised more money and put up a deer fence, but then someone has to maintain the deer fence. Yes, we used herbicide quite a lot at the beginning, and that caused quite a lot of adverse reactions from people who assumed that because we were into restoring woodland, we must be totally green in our attitude to everything like herbicides. And in the end, we felt that with a bit of screefing, you know, scratching the soil and keeping the grass down, you could establish trees without using herbicide. So that's a possible lesson. I'm not really replying to your question very well, I'm afraid.
you might find out that the second time around things established more quickly. You might not even know what you did wrong for the first time.
Yes.
Just
Yeah, that's true.
knowledge. Okay.
So Jonathan had his hand up first.
Yes, to follow up with John's question about being really wild, of course there is an answer, which is to introduce wolves. What about that?
I agree with you 100%. I think we're probably more likely to succeed with lynx first, but yeah, that is what we would love to do that. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it.
May not be big enough for wolves.
Well, it probably isn't, yeah.
Yes.
All the trees eventually spread down beside the burn into the gullies and overwhelm all your interesting patches of herbs.
Well, if they do, so be it. You know, we are trying not to interfere apart from the three things that we reckon we're going to have to go on doing. My suspicion is that there will always be open spaces. And of course, the gravel shifts, the burn floods, the gravel shifts. So it's not an ideal place for trees to grow. I think there will always be a good herb development of herbs myself.
Yes, maybe.
How far we've seen the regeneration spread up exponentially.
So the question was, how far has natural regeneration spread up the hill from 400 meters?
Not a lot yet. but we are optimistic. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. We're optimistic because of the success we've had at planting high up. You know, I showed you those high plantings where the unfortunate people were camping in the snow. Most of what they planted has succeeded. So I think it's just a question of time. Of course, it won't happen everywhere. It'll be patchy. There'll be tongues creeping up the valleys, probably. Tongues of tree development.
Do you know what the success rate is for planting?
Oh, I should be able to tell you. I'd have to ask the project officer. You mean per sapling planted?
Yes.
I don't.
I mean, has the information been collected? So
yes, it has, because this all had to be fed back to the tree planting scheme,
okay,
so that we got our second tranche of the grant. Yeah. Okay,
that's good. So, Claudia, thank you.
The water running down the valleys, he said it was a big watershed. Any analysis of the water has been done at the start and now?
So
to see whether tree cover helped with retaining more kind of solids on the slopes.
Yes, well,
so the question was, has the tree planting affected the water quality coming up?
I don't know if it's affected the quality. It certainly affected how fast the water moves. We would need to get, we'd need to get a hydrologist in to examine the water quality, I imagine. Maybe you could help us with that.
Well, CEH can. We have some water specialists here. Have you done anything with the water inverts?
No.
You haven't.
No.
There we go. People from CEH.
Yes.
Where's Ian?
No,
there's Ian. You can go and look
right.
at some water inverts and things.
Please do. Yes.
Yes, David.
You said that you're aiming to have fairly open woodland. Have you done any actual drainage to help trees develop?
Have we done any drainage?
Yes.
I think we would consider that interference too far.
I'm glad to hear.
If you start doing drainage, you might as well do mounding when you're planting them.
Well,
or
I'm very glad to hear.
Dig great channels through the countryside. No, thank you.
Yes.
I was wondering if you'd like to see beaver.
We would love to see beavers again, but it's one of our number, Hugh Chalmers, who was our first project officer, is an enormous beaver enthusiast. He's also an enthusiast for what he calls pigs on holiday, which basically means introducing some fairly unrefined breed of pig to live in Carrifran for maybe 3 weeks or 4 weeks, so they break up the turf, which will then allow birch and other seeds to germinate. Because one of the problems is we still have quite a dense grass sward in many places. But I got a feeling that neither pigs on holiday nor beavers are going to happen in the near future. But it isn't a big enough area for beavers. We need to acquire the whole area of Moffat Dale running down from where Carrifran abuts onto Moffat Water to give the beavers enough to keep them happy.
The trees probably aren't big enough yet.
No, they're not.
To support the beavers.
No. No, they're not.
So what's the funding for the future? I mean, is it guaranteed in perpetuity?
Well, you can never say that. I think we feel that because we are now very firmly nested inside Borders Forest Trust, that probably the future of Carrifran is reasonably well assured. But like many organisations, we suffer from a poor age profile. I am not the oldest person in the steering group. I'm not the youngest either. The steering group is composed of people who are mostly well retired. I think we have only 2 people who are not retired in the steering group. It's a serious problem.
Well, we have some students here.
Yeah.
To hear the call, please, young people. We want them in the box up too.
Yes.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. That was wonderful. It's so lovely to see you.